David, on Wednesdays, you and I come together to do this show that goes out on YouTube, on Periscope, on Facebook, on all of the platforms that we utilize, and we let people know about the regular show you and I have been doing each Friday that has a special component that's available only to sponsors on Patreon. And I really want to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors. First, let me thank you, David, for joining me today. You're looking well. How is everything?
It's a pleasure. Yeah, no, I'm well, and as usual, excited about our voyages of discovery.
And you know, last night, Mike Moore of True Pundit declared Canada America's hat. So, congratulations on that.
And what kind of hat would that be? A deer stalker or?
I don't know. It was just a funny statement. Of course, you're there in British Columbia and conducting your unique brand of investigation that involves seeking out technological signatures and then matching those signatures to the unique technologies within the patent office. And of course, as you and I have collaborated over the past several months, I guess maybe over a year, we should go back and check exactly when we began, but we've had some really interesting encounters, people including Wilbur Ross, who wants to talk about space, but not patents.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the boast is that America has processed 10 million patents in the history of the patent office. Notwithstanding, I believe that the first 30,000, I believe, were lost to the British. I mean, that's speculation. When they burnt down the patent office in 1836, having not burnt it down in 1812. I don't know if you the story, the Brits were sacking Washington, and someone suggested that it would be a crime against humanity to burn the patent office down. So the British general at the time decided to leave it, and evidently the British intelligence service said, well, why don't we wait until these Americans, who with their newly found independence, have got a good body of patents that we can steal. So my theory is they stole all the patents, the first 10,000 patents, and then burnt the patent office down, and I think it was in 1836. And then fast forward to the present, in your wisdom, Wilbur Ross and Donald Trump and the crony Clintons have decided to outsource the patent office to the same company that probably masterminded the original sacking, or a derivative of it. And that, of course, is RCA. And I know you've been getting a number of responses about what my attitude is towards some famous inventors, including George H. Swigert. So let me make this clear. I'm an inventor, and I have a deductive computing machine and an object-oriented fractal paintbrush to my credit. Sometimes people use them as a cure for insomnia, but that's all right. It's pretty heavy stuff. But the problem with patents is mostly you're an individual with a bright idea. You commit your life, your resources, your energy to inventing it. And then there are a few people who come after you and try and screw you out of your intellectual property. And one famous guy is a fellow called Edwin Armstrong, who was greatly admired by George H. Swigert. And the reason why George H. Swigert admired him was because he'd taken on David Sarnoff and RCA, Radio Corporation of America. But in fact, of course, RCA would have outspent him, and eventually this poor man committed suicide. And I attribute that typically to the kind of pressure people like me, perhaps George H. Swigert and Edwin Armstrong, come under when you've got an idea that someone else wants to exploit. Over to you.
You know, I'm not sure about this. We'd have to check the internet archives, and frequently the sons of George Henry Swigert are in a regular practice of deleting their internet histories, but I do believe that David Swigert has boasted of a legal case in which the person he was pursuing ultimately committed suicide. We would need to get some more details about that, but he's an interesting guy who has turned around the facts of what we've said into an accusation that you never made. We never said that George Henry Swigert had any involvement. We've made no accusations that George Henry Swigert was remotely involved in the death of John Benet Ramsey, merely the speculation of this patented technology and what role any particular patented technology might play in a high-value target incident led us to investigate what is a fact, that a cordless phone was used to call the police by the mother of John Benet Ramsey. And certainly, was it 1986? When was John Benet killed, David?
It was 1997, and it was a very symbolic day because I think they arranged her murder on Christmas Day of 1997. And I think that's absolutely the fundamental point here, that what we're saying is that all of these technologies are vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack.
Right.
And the company that is perpetrating these attacks, I believe, is this British company, Serco, which used to be called RCAGB 1929. Mm-hmm. And just to give you an idea of how deeply embedded, and I still shake my head at the failure of the American government to understand the danger of this man-in-the-middle attack, just to give you a flavor of how deeply embedded Serco is in the American military, let me read you what they say about their job at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Digital Fires Instructor, Serco, Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, California. Uses information derived from all military disciplines, e.g. aviation, ground combat, command and control, combat service support, intelligent and opposing forces, to determine changes in enemy capabilities, vulnerabilities, and probable course of action. Well, for me, that begs the question, who's the enemy? You've got a British company, Serco, instructing the Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton, and people we know, including Phil McConnell, is a Marine Corps vet, and General Mad Dog Mattis, who just quit the White House, is a Marine Corps vet, as I understand it. And what the hell are these Marine Corps vets and senior people allowing Serco, digital fires instructor status at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, to teach how the enemy might be vulnerable? Because I would argue, if I wanted to infiltrate the American military, well, let's see if America's military is vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack.
Right.
And of course you are, because on 9/11, a man-in-the-middle attack took out the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. So this is beyond absurd. And I repeat again, I think the most important thing Trump can do, and I think this is where the plug to the swamp is, and he should be talking to you, because you can tell him where the plug to the swamp is. It's Serco and its investment banker, N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, for the which, or for the whom, Wilbur Ross worked 25 years. Over to you.
Right. Right. And of course, David, the man-in-the-middle attack is a major recurring theme in our conversations. It's an incredibly effective method that basically is as old as communication itself. If the recipient or the person responsible for transmitting the message can alter the message, well, then the recipient can be completely fooled. And again, I want to reiterate that we aren't accusing George Henry Swigert of any involvement. We're just pointing out that his invention, which he originally patented, the cordless phone, particularly the cordless phone in 1997, would be particularly, it's very difficult to say that word with this echo in my ears, particularly, too many LYs in that.
It's even worse.
Yes, it's definitely susceptible to, yeah. I have an echo every time I speak from this headset, so some words are difficult for me to get out. It's definitely susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack because prior to the use of digital cordless phones, the transmission from the handset to the base was not encrypted in any way, and radios operating in the same frequency range could receive signals being sent from the handset to the base, and of course could transmit signals from itself to the base and could intercept the whole phone call and change it. Right?
Well, absolutely, and that's true of all communications technologies ever since. And that's why I believe these so-called global custodian banks, which are investors in Serco, are so keen on grabbing any patent that comes along and looking at it. And remember that Serco has the contract to screen patent applications. So the Americans have allowed a British company to cherry pick patents and screen them and classify them. And I think one or two of the criteria that Serco uses, and they are using AI algorithms, artificial intelligence algorithms, is whether or not the patent application has left a back door so that it can be hacked, right? And whether or not that patented device can be synchronized with the clock at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, which means that by the time of the present, the global custodians and Serco and its investment banker have a complete man-in-the-middle position for the American government and the Five Eyes. And we're paying a terrible price because, for example, one of the things that gives them is the ability to do what's called front running in the stock market. That is to say, they know, right, when the price of gold is going up or down, or whether Nortel Shares, which was this Canadian company that went up to $120 a share and then went down to zero, and 6,000 patents, called Nortel patents, went south to Apple and Microsoft, where sitting on the board of Apple is that blowhard Al Gore, right? Exactly. So it's actually costing the globe, the world, we the people, an enormous amount of money to allow Serco to continue to occupy these man-in-the-middle functions, like, for example, digital fires instruction at Camp Pendleton for the Marine Corps.
David, what is a digital fire? Excuse me for interrupting, but digital fires, what is that?
Well, personally, that means to me the opportunity of taking up a digital position, a man-in-the-middle position on your enemy, because what they describe it is you're looking for your enemy's vulnerabilities. Well, from the British intelligence point of view, or Serco's intelligence point of view, America is just sitting there like a ripe plum to be plucked, right? Because you've lost all sense of, not integrity, that's the wrong word, elegance in your intelligence agencies, because America has 18 intelligence agencies. Now, whether Trump is the smartest or sharpest knife in the drawer is irrelevant. He cannot collect advice from 18 intelligence agencies and sort out which is the closest to the truth and the most relevant to his next action. Over to you.
Well, and of course, we've looked at this story from the San Diego Union Tribune, which I've just noticed bears a remarkable resemblance, the website at least, to the Washington Post. I wonder how many of these newspapers are owned by the same people but published under different names to give the false sense of corroboration. That is another common theme, David. People using false names and fake allies and all these proxies to build a sense of false consent. Obviously, if the Washington Post says something and then it's repeated by the San Diego Union Tribune, that seems like a chorus and maybe lends more credibility to it. But this is an article we've looked at in the past about fires burning at Camp Pendleton. And I mean, this doesn't seem like a digital fire. Is a digital fire talking about, sort of a cyber militia? Is that what it means?
You got it. Now, and digital fire, of course, is you can have digital ignition by an artist or by an arsonist of fuel. The interesting thing, I think, the term digital fires in the case of Serco at Camp Pendleton, it could be used in some of the other Serco projects. So Serco is the preferred command control, communications, computers, cyber and crypto, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance provider to the American company Boeing, right? So on today's post, remember what we were going to talk about was the link between Princess Diana,
yes,
and the Bin Laden command center.
Right.
Now, I'm not a military guy, but I follow military strategy to a certain extent, like the article by Serco about digital fires at Camp Pendleton, and I look at the possibility of a guy, facetiously I often describe him as a long-bearded wonder straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan.
Right.
And my argument would be that this was a term that Phil McConnell gave me, you need an on-scene commander to eyeball the action at the cutting edge to see who's moving fast and where your resources are and where you risk the greatest discovery, etc., etc. So the war games of Amalgam Virgo, 1st and 2nd of June of 2001, and the Global Guardian exercise of September the 10th to the 12th show this long-bearded wonder, not straddling a yak, right? But he's on the front page
Playing
of the
karaoke.
exercise, yeah, representing the red team leader.
Yeah.
Now, there's a huge difference in time and resources and geography between a guy in a cave in Afghanistan and the devastation at ground zero. Now, you remember the particular example they showed us for the Raytheon 10 millionth patent as a demonstration of what it could do, and it was a laser 3D configuration construction type thing. Do you remember that image at ground zero?
I should have had that ready.
Well, no sweat. I mean, if we can find it later, but it's a totally dramatic image. So this was the Wilbur Ross Donald Trump announcement, I think, from the White House office, where they showed up the patent paper. Yeah, there it is. My understanding is that that's a Raytheon patent that refers to a laser system for building a three-dimensional image from either a satellite or an overhead aircraft. But the one that exemplifies this technology that they chose to show in the media, and I think there are no coincidences, this would have been a warning to we the sheeple, was the image constructed using this technology of ground zero, where there is obviously total and complete and utter devastation. And then coming back to the topic that we may be discussing in this show, is you have buildings 1 and 2, which are obviously obliterated and flattened. Then you have a row of buildings somewhat damaged. And then you have building number 7, known as the Salomon Smith Barney building. Now, this building was leased. Larry Silverstein had trouble leasing it for whatever reason. And eventually he found the Salomon Smith Barney, I guess they're investment bankers. They took the lease for the bulk of the building in 1988, which, as you know, we've been discussing at great length what happened in 1988, including the IPO of Serco, the initial public offering of Serco.
Yeah.
And the first laying of a fiber optic link across the Atlantic for the it's called the Transatlantic Telephone Cable number 8.
Right.
Right. Now, I don't know where that landed. What I'm suggesting to Americans is that it landed somewhere near, or was routed to, or linked to the World Trade Center complex. Right. Now, why would they do that? Because that would give the insiders of the investment in the transatlantic fiber optic cable the opportunity, to put it quite bluntly, to front run a lot of transactions on the stock market. And building number 7, I don't know if you were aware, it had the Securities and Exchange Commission offices.
Yeah.
Right?
It had a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah, but no backup files. And the Security and Exchange Commission had been investigating major frauds.
No backup files? How could they have no backup files?
Well, that's your
ridiculous.
question. You're an American journalist. That might be someone you get on that show and ask them why they don't have a backup. They didn't want to have backup files because they wanted to lose the investigations into massive frauds on Wall Street,
right?
Which basically break down into insider trading, outsider trading, churning, and pump and dump.
Right.
And almost every major company has been targeted by this garbage, right? But there's a very sophisticated operation perpetrating it, and I believe the command center was in building number 7. Over to you.
Well, okay, so before we get into the evaluation of any links between Diana's death and bin Laden, she was hanging out with Dodi Al-Fayed, so that's interesting. He's Saudi royal, isn't he? Was?
His father, I'm not sure if
Harrods
he's
or
Saudi,
something
but he
like
was
that.
the owner of Harrods, right?
Yeah.
And he owned the Paris Ritz Hotel, and he owned a fleet of very private wealthy, cars, etc., etc. But the particular, did
Egyptian.
you want to talk about?
He wasn't Saudi. He was
Yeah,
son
that's
of
right.
an Egyptian billionaire, Mohammed El Fayed, died in a car crash
Yeah.
with Diana, Princess of Wales, on the 31st of August 1997. But let me take you back for a moment, David, because so much of what we discuss has to do with the patent office. And I didn't know about this fire in the patent office until you started telling me about it. And it's interesting to think about because, back in 1836, you didn't have data centers with multiple redundant backups. Like, it's so crazy to think that something as important as financial data, being held by super rich people with offices in the World Trade Center, wouldn't have a backup. I mean, that is really difficult to imagine. But certainly in 1836, making backups of things was difficult. It required, you didn't have a photocopier. I guess you could photograph things, but if something was written, you needed somebody to rewrite it and copy it in order to have a backup. So the concept of burning down the patent office would essentially be destroying all human records of these great inventions that could basically advance humanity. So destroying it would take these inventions out of circulation. And when you start to think about that detail, the strategic value of this patent office as a spoil of war for a victor becomes clear. So we have this 1836 patent office fire, which I believe you've told me destroyed the patent office. And then we have this 1877 patent office fire. What are the important differences between these two events, David, and how does it fit into your overall hypothesis related to patents and technological signatures at crime scenes?
Well, I believe that, and I love this phrase, you may have heard me say it before, the imperial brain, right? So
Yeah.
Britain ran an amazing empire. And, a lot of people say that there is an American empire. I don't think the Americans have ever been particularly interested in empire building because they have a huge landmass with enormous resources and a very talented group of people. They don't need to build an empire. Whatever it was, this piddly little island, that maybe back in its heyday had 20 or 30 million people. Apparently, anywhere in the UK, you're within 1 day's ride to the sea. So we became a maritime seafaring nation with some great sailors, including one of my ancestors, I believe, Sir John Hawkins, but that's kind of by the by. Enormous coal reserves, etc., but a very clear understanding that anyone who made an interesting invention that could be used for either war or peace, you needed to grab hold of it and grab their invention or buy them in or kill them or whatever. So it's just, as Lord Palmerston, the great British Prime Minister, said, great powers do not have allies, they have interests.
Right.
So another phrase I have from a friend is, it's nothing personal. Actually, what I'm starting to look at on 911 is, it was nothing personal. It was a great power decided to capture a lot of patented technologies that were absolutely fundamental to running a supranational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite. So going back to the point about the patent office, if this is speculation, but I would love our audience to help us solve the crime, if you will. If, as I believe, the first 10,000 patents and copyright and models were taken by the British back to the UK to turbocharge the Industrial Revolution, then obviously you'd need to burn the place down to remove any evidence that there weren't any patents inside the building when it was burnt down, right?
Well, it's the
That I
perfect
think is
way to spoliate evidence of your pillaging and theft.
right. And that's why it's important that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Building Number 7 didn't have backups because they, let's say the global custodians of this stuff, they didn't want some nasty backup rearing its head to discover that they were actually investing fraud by, for example, Serco or its custodian banks who met on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 911. Over to you.
Yeah. All right, so let's focus in on what the topic for today is. We've got Diana and Dodi Al Fayed crashing in the tunnel that I can never remember the name of, and perhaps What is it?
The pont, which is French for bridge, d'Alma, the bridge of Alma. I don't know who Alma was. Maybe she was a Greek goddess.
Well, the thing that's so interesting about that, let me Google it here real quick. That Pont d'Alma Bridge is that, I love it when this happens, David. I have so many different guests. I'm really honored to have that, and it's been a privilege. But everyone who comes on the show obviously has a unique point of view, a unique area of interest, and a unique way of studying this stuff. So when there's crossover between my guests, I like to point it out because it often results in thinking about things differently for everyone. Ole Damegard has frequently brought to my attention the symbology that's used by some of these so-called secret societies. The eternal flame is a strong one, a Masonic symbol that is usually present at a memorial or something having to do with a sacrifice. And it's interesting to note that this flame of liberty, which is intended to be a replica of the Statue of Liberty's torch, this is right on top of the tunnel in which the car accident occurred that killed Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed. So it's an interesting and coincidental point of fact that there's this monument to the death there.
I remember reading a book in my teenage years called The Migration of Symbols. Mm-hmm. And symbols are very slippery things, you see, because quite often people are left chasing the symbol or trying to interpret the symbology. We had a brief look at that medallion around the young neck of Barack Hussein Obama, or Barry Soetoro, as he would have been known then. And there's an enigmatic signal there which might be related to whatever. I prefer to, come back to the nuts and bolts of the patent office, because the beauty of what is described in the patent office is very, maybe dull in one sense, but it's very precise language. And it allows you mentally, which is what I do and have been doing for decades now, is engage in virtual systems integration. So I look at a patent, like the patent that describes, for example, the ITT patent that allows you to guide a remotely controlled vehicle. And I say, well, now do the characteristic marks in the road of the Mercedes S280, driven by Henri Paul, the chauffeur for little Princess Diana, is its behavior, the marks in the road, consistent with remote capture of that S280 Mercedes? And lo and behold, there are no skid marks, there are no brake marks on the road, there are only yaw marks. Now, yaw marks, if I understand, maybe that's somewhat familiar with you in the camera world. Yaw is the rotation of the camera, is that right?
Well, yaw would have come more into the drone days when I was working with a company called Aerocine, but I was more of the manager of that company and not that, I wasn't the expert on the drone. So roll, I believe,
pitch, roll, and yaw.
Pitch is pointing downward, roll is like twisting along the center axis of a plane, and yaw is left and right.
And yaw is like that. Yeah. All right. Now, so people have analyzed that, and I believe they took a Mercedes 280S and put hydraulic brakes and computer guidance systems, and then tethered it electronically to another Mercedes to see if they could replicate the marks, right? And they discovered, and I believe it was being interpreted by multiple experts, that this has the characteristics of what the British call a Boston brakes attack, where the automatic braking system and the steering system has been captured electronically so that the vehicle could be steered into the path of another vehicle. So it looks like an accident, but in fact it's a murder. It's contract hit, right? So the other day, I think I'd already glimpsed it, but I went back into the patent office, as you know I do, to see if I could find any patents that related to this. And I think I sent you the title. Let me just see what the title is. It's an ITT patent. Current assignee Exalis Inc. And I'm going to come back to that. It's very important. Original assignee ITT, and that's always interesting when there's a change in assignment, because that might imply extortion. Because if one party that invented it has been assigned it, and they've handed off a strategic patent to someone else, maybe they're doing it because someone's holding a gun to their head.
David, look at this. This thing is talking about ITT Exalis reaches patent settlement agreements with Verizon, Qualcomm, LG, and Kyocera. Didn't we learn that is ITT and ITT Technical Institute the same thing?
It was, I think, a wholly owned subsidiary of ITT. That's where George H. Schweiger taught, I believe.
Huh.
And that school was folded or went into bankruptcy because I think it was accused of overcharging students and giving them very poor value for money in terms of their qualifications when they left. But anyway, back up the ladder. ITT had offices on the 19th to the 21st floor of building number 7, which I believe was the command center for the 9/11 attack. Now, in that building, there were a number of very, very important players. On the 25th floor, there was the CIA and IRS and Department of Defense offices. So I asked the question of Americans, why do you take the CIA and the IRS and the Department of Defense, put them on the same floor of building number 7, which is then destroyed? Like, what are you hiding? You know what I mean? And apparently, Dodi and Princess Diana were being tracked by a joint combination of MI6 and the CIA because of obviously very important implications from vulnerability to blackmail, etc., is that Princess Diana might one day end up marrying Dodi. He's a Muslim, she's a Christian, and obviously there's great scope for skullduggery, if you will, or blackmail. So anyway, they were being followed, but the marks in the road outside of just by the pillar which was struck, the 13th pillar in the Pont d'Alma road tunnel, there are no brake marks and there are yaw marks. Now, the chauffeur, Henri Paul, when they did an autopsy, there seems to be great confusion about where the blood was taken, but the blood contained between 14 and 21% carbon monoxide, which is a huge amount of carbon. Carbon monoxide is a poison. As I've often said, carbon dioxide, not me, I'm quoting someone, carbon dioxide is a wholly beneficial, transparent, odorless fertilizer gas in trace quantities, about 390 parts per million in the Earth's atmosphere. You have to be actually living on another planet to believe that carbon dioxide is a driver of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. But I digress. But my point about the inventions is ITT also has a company called Exalis, EXELIX. And Exalis, you can Google, I think, Exalis ATM, air traffic management, a little video. I don't know if it's almost worth showing. No, it probably takes about 3 minutes, so maybe it's too long. But in that video, it shows the device made by Exalis for a remote area air traffic control. So if you go into Afghanistan, for example, there are no close air traffic control towers. So they send in a portable air traffic control tower in a truck, which dismounts. Out come the radar antenna, etc., etc. And then they do a simulation of the air traffic control of an upfront area for battlefield conditions. Yeah, there you are, you got it. And then the interesting words appearing on the screen are ad hoc waypoints. Now, that road collision in the Pont d'Alma road tunnel and the planes coming in to strike the towers 1 and 2, they exhibit all the behavior of imputed ad hoc waypoints. And the only immediate vicinity of companies that would be able to impute ad hoc waypoints into the planes that struck ultimately the north face of the North Tower and the south face of the South Tower is ITT and Building 7. Over to you.
Well, David, while you're talking to us, one of the things that you've said has really caught my attention. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been making the news quite a lot lately. Her first speech in Congress, she was talking about her constituents who are being negatively impacted by this government shutdown, which they're obviously trying to blame on Donald Trump. And during this speech, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talks about a migrant from Yemen whose dream it was to become a pilot, who works in her district in Queens, New York, as an air traffic controller at John F. Kennedy Airport. Now, her speech reminded me that in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan busted an air traffic controller strike by firing all the air traffic controllers and turning it into a federal job. Now, that was in the 1980s. I was a little kid. I don't really remember the politics or the details surrounding that air traffic controller strike, but it occurred to me that this is not a job that should be a federal job, because taxpayers pay for federal workers' salaries, and someone who never uses airplanes shouldn't be forced to pay the salary of an air traffic controller. And frankly, I think airports and airlines and companies that specifically make money from air transit should be paying these jobs, and it should be a private sector job. So for me at least, AOC's speech had possibly the opposite of the intended effect, because it just made me think that we should be revisiting many of these jobs that are currently federal jobs and privatize them. The United States is not a socialist country, and I don't think we really want socialism to take over. Obviously, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does, and other people who've never built businesses or invented things or care about being motivated probably like socialism. But what do you think about that, David? Air traffic control.
Well, socialism is an interesting term, and capitalism. When I was at university, I did my third year. I did my engineering course. I was on the fast course. I did it because I think they thought I was a smart character. So I did it in 2 years. And in my third year, I did industrial management. And the first lecture, I still remember, because it seemed so weird. I had some nodding experience of industry because I'd served an apprenticeship. And the professor, whose name I forget, had said, when you go into industry as a manager, you're going to be confronted with three ideologies. And one is more dangerous than the other two. So our ears prick up. And he said, well, there's capitalism, which I think I understood. There's communism, or maybe socialism, if you want to use your term. And he said, and there's bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy, Jason, is by far more dangerous than either capitalism or communism, because you can't find anyone who takes responsibility for any unethical or malfeasant act, right? Now, the master bureaucracy in the United States, who probably arrogated more power than the president, is, of course, Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister. People continue to try and dismiss her role, but I like to remind people that she founded the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund with Eric Holder, which is basically a license to steal. That is to say, as I jokingly sometimes, you're driving around with your Lamborghini because of your ill-gotten gains and, whatever, and you're stopped in New York, right? And they say, how do you support the Lamborghini? You can't justify it. They take your Lamborghini and you have to sue them to get it back, right? In the same year that she founded the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, it appears she founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, right? Which is a pretty extraordinary organization. And Conair, that is to say, the first Conair plane, I think it was a Boeing 737, was bought for the United States Marshals prisoner transportation system, right? So there's this woman with three asset-rich networks, children who immensely vulnerable for tracking because their parents have been put into jail, by Christine Marcy perhaps. The money that you need perhaps to mount an attack on 911 sitting in the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, And the Conair fleet of aircraft, which is flying some of the most dangerous men and women around the country, potentially they can be put in position at a crime scene before the crime occurs. And then after the crime, they can be put back in jail. So you got this ability with this woman. I don't want to focus too much on Christine Marcy, but to deploy criminals with expert terrorists or expert intelligence agents into a place like Paris on around the 31st of August of 1997, with all of the technologies necessary to hijack a road vehicle like a S280 Mercedes driven by Henri Paul, or back in New York on 911 to hijack aircraft that are flying along their normal en route airway, and then take them off the en route airway, impute ad hoc waypoints, and fly them into buildings and attribute it to the long-bearded wonder in a cave in Afghanistan. It doesn't work like that, Jason. Over to you.
I think a lot of people, David, when they hear about electronic hijacking of a Mercedes, are going to think about Michael Hastings' untimely death. And of course, he was driving a Mercedes. He was driving it, I think it was on Sunset Boulevard, which it's very difficult to even find that road in a state where there's enough, there's normally a lot of traffic. Driving 100 miles an hour on this road would seem quite difficult. And this car is super exploded. Mercedes has been very big in automated driving, although I don't believe these vehicles are commercially, a fully automated vehicle is not yet commercially available, but we've seen many examples of it. And I guess this hypothesis would require us to understand that Mercedes would have had at least some form of technology that would allow this.
Yeah, so we need to and engage the public to whatever extent we can into understanding what was described by Sherlock Holmes in the Conan Doyle stories as backward reasoning, and what I call reverse engineering. What you and I believe now we've got a very clear understanding of the methodology, that you look at the particular characteristics of the crime scene or the accident. You see if there are any anomalies to the explanation being given to you by the government or whoever has a vested interest in perpetrating fake news. See if there are any anomalies that they can't explain, and then go into the patent office and see if the patents can be configured away. And it's basically a thought experiment, but anyone who's got experience in systems integration, such as myself, you can clip together these patents as in a sort of Lego box and create a meta machine that describes the events at the crime scene. And the important thing is you don't attach your ego to the theory. It's a hypothesis and test, the basic scientific method. So if it doesn't work to create the hole through the Pentagon with a Boeing 737, well, pop into the patent office and look for that Lockheed Martin rocket boosted hardened penetrator, and that fits precisely the profile of the hole punched through 8 walls of the Pentagon into the inner courtyard to create a 12-foot diameter hole and 1.5 tons of debris on the outside. And 10 minutes later, after impact, out at the front of the Pentagon, you have a line of people, as far as I can tell, with FBI T-shirts being shuffled or moved along the Pentagon lawn, picking up evidence of what did hit the Pentagon and taking it away. It comes back to my point. What they're doing is they have such a sophisticated operation engaged in spin and spoil. Spin meaning injecting the story they want you to believe into the media, and spoil, short for spoliation, meaning, which is a felony, taking evidence away or planting evidence at the crime scene and then telling you what happened and assuming that the span of attention of the audience or whatever, of the public at large, they want to move on to the next event. Right? So who's talking about the Al-Shabaab attack in Nairobi? That, back 2 weeks ago? Nothing. It's gone. Right? It's been erased from human consciousness. Now, the BBC is very quick, the BBC being one of the world's premier propaganda, news, and entertainment media, because of course in the UK you have to pay a television license fee, so the BBC doesn't have any competition. But we should always go back with the roots in the Patent Office and discover that in 1924 the BBC was founded by these companies producing communications technology like STC and RCA. Right? So I believe the BBC has always been under the control, as is the media, of the big technical communications companies. Over to you.
Well, I think that's right. I didn't really even hear about this attack in Nairobi, although here it is reported in the New York Times.
And it's some outfit called Shabab from Somalia, but the
Al-Shabaab,
BBC
yeah.
doesn't choose to look at the DNA and the roots and the equipment that Al-Shabaab is getting. Well, apparently, it was a big shoot-up, but lo and behold, you dig back into the United States, and for some absurd reason, in their wisdom, and I don't think it was the Trump administration, I think it was done during the Obama years, they've outsourced the operation of the United States Defense Ammunition Center to Serco, Jason. Why?
I don't know. It doesn't make any sense.
But that means that Serco is tracking every bullet, every ballistic weapon, every munition around the world. So why wouldn't they track the precision mortar shells that were rained down on the CIA annex in Benghazi? Right?
Why would we allow a corporation to have access to that information?
And a British corporation.
Seems like it should be classified. So here's what I'm getting at, David. We've got Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez defending people who have government jobs that shouldn't be government jobs. And we have private industry, in the case of Serco as a corporation, handling military technology and access that should be a government job. So we've got this reverse of corporate and government action.
Right. And therefore, what I see is, why are there so many non-barking dogs around, where honorable, capable, intelligent people, right, within the military and the legislatures and various parts in the Five Eyes countries, why are they so silent? You know, obviously you have the basic levers of sex, fear, greed, and power, which some combination of which will affect us all at some time in our lives. But I think what is particularly sinister, and that goes back to the John Benet Ramsey, is the idea that there could be a Department of Justice sector, and it's called DOJ Pride, which is favoring people with a particular sexual orientation. Right? Now, if you go through DOJ Pride, you see it represents the LGBT or community in the United States Marshal Service, the FBI, the Office of Justice Programs, the Bureau of Prisons, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. And remember, they were big at the Murrah building bomb.
Yeah.
And the United States Attorney's Office. And you, I believe, sooner or later, you get caught in the web of someone suing you, or you're suing them, or whatever. But what we should all be thinking is, isn't this the ultimate man-in-the-middle attack, to take the Department of Justice and sector out a community based on sexual orientation, allow them to infiltrate the various government departments responsible for either stopping or law enforcement, and then you get the absurdity, and I think Robert Mueller is a part of this, X months or years after the 9/11 attack, the National Academy of Public Administration, which is the #1 bureaucratic think tank, was commissioned by Congress to write a paper on the transformation of the FBI in the light of the 9/11 attacks. That was written, and the secretary for that paper was Christine Marcy, who at one time had been president of the National Academy of Public Administration. I think it's called The Transformation of the FBI. And these turkeys made a recommendation that there should be a major shift of the FBI from law enforcement and crime scene investigations. So maybe you and I are the only people left to do it, right? to the prevention of terrorism, right? Well, and what happened is 5,000 agents in the FBI who might otherwise be focused on the kind of work that you and I are doing, right, on behalf of the public or with the public's help, were transferred from law enforcement and crime scene investigation to thwarting terrorism. Well, when you've got that number of able bodies trying to thwart terrorism, in order to earn your stripes, you need to find quite a lot of terrorist threats that you can thwart. And how successful has that been? So going back to my university days, and when he said, the professor said, you're going to have three ideologies when you become a manager in industry or business or whatever. There's capitalism, communism or socialism, and bureaucracy. Your number one issue, I think, in the United States and in Canada and in many countries around the world is the bureaucracy. And I'm not saying that the bureaucrats are bad, but they work according to a program. So if you tell a bureaucrat your number one responsibility is neutralizing the carbon footprint of the airline industry, right? And you're told that one of the best ways of doing that is to set up an artificial intelligence algorithm in the patent office to find or identify or implement or reward patentees who come up with technologies that do neutralize carbon footprints, you're going to end up with a patent office sooner or later, and it's going to go rogue on you. And in the case of America, I believe the American Patent Office has gone rogue on America, aided and abetted by Serco and its shareholders, which include 10 investment banks known as global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management. Over to you.
Would it not be more accurate, David, to say rather than being aided and abetted, the patent office was sort of dragged kicking and screaming by Serco?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And using this backdrop of blackmail and extortion and entrapment. Now, my understanding about Barack Hussein Obama is he was raised, his mother, Ann Dunham, and Lola Sotero, which was his stepfather, his Muslim stepfather, basically handed him off when he was 7 years old to the tender care of a cross-dressing male prostitute called Turdy.
Yeah.
And they used to put lipstick on each other, etc., etc. I'm sure he was a lovely lad, but can you imagine recovering from what may be sexualized grooming by a nanny? Right?
Now, David,
Now, am I saying anything bad about him? Is he black? Yes, maybe. I don't care what color scheme he runs by, you see, but you end up in the White House and he has a body man, right? Reggie Love, who's a football player. Well, that's an odd term, isn't it, for the president to describe his aide as a body man? What about bodyguard? That's normally, sufficient for most people. Over to you.
Well, David, while you were talking about this, I found this webpage that someone created specifically about Obama's childhood medallion. This is talking about the art of genetic engineering. I mean, my first presumption would be that this is just some sort of trinket, possibly meaningless, worn by a child. Who knows what might have appealed to Obama about it? He might have just thought it was a cool looking thing. Sometimes children's taste in clothing and accessories might be quite different than what an adult might favor. So it could just be something that he saw and liked and chose to wear. But these guys are having some kind of an email conversation from Michael R. to Ken Adachi. Do you have any info on the pendant worn by young Obama on this page? And Ken seems to think it represents a gray alien. So.
Well, yeah, and so, one can speculate endlessly about those symbols, but maybe you can show up Eric Gill's, as in Gill's script, sculpture outside the BBC Bush House, right? Because I'm just looking at that symbol. And there is a picture of a man surrounded by naked boys. And I think this was put up in the 1930s. Yeah, well, there it is. If you look at that, there's something very, what should I put? Evil is the wrong word. But, in this day and age when we're very careful or hypersensitive about pedophilia and so on, this guy, Eric Gill, was a pedophile. He
And
even had an
that's
affair with the
known.
family's dog.
That that's known, or that's presumed based on
Yes,
his artwork.
yes, yes. No, no, it's known.
Hmm.
He was a very unpleasant character. Now, what does that mean that the BBC has this as a sort of major iconic piece of sculpture? Many people have said it should be taken down.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like
Now,
Charles Manson or something wouldn't be. Yeah, here we go. BBC urged to remove sculpture from the Daily
right
Mail.
now, fast forward, you have Jimmy Savile, that I think is the equivalent of your Jeffrey Epstein,
Yeah.
who for 40 or 50 years was
Whoa.
abusing children,
Yeah, he
right?
raped his daughters.
Yes. He even had an affair with the family dog. I mean, the guy was about as sick as you can get.
Right.
Very talented sculptor, etc. So now, how does cultural values get implanted inside the BBC? Well, allowing that kind of thing to happen, to go on. If someone tells me that the senior people in the BBC didn't know about Jimmy Savile, I said, I've got some swamp in Florida to sell you. I can't quite
It's the bridge
remember
in
the
Brooklyn.
phrase.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey Epstein, right, flies Bill Clinton 20 times to Little St. John's Island, and Hillary Clinton 6 times to Little St. John's Island, where they apparently can have consensual sex, if that's the right term, with underage minor. Uh,
I'm not sure it's
Apparently
consensual. I think it's.
Yeah, well, exactly. It could be forced. There's a dentist chair in the bathroom of one of the chalets. The island is supposed to have burnt down. How you burn down an island is beyond me. But apparently Epstein, in every room, had cameras recording what was going on. This was a blackmail and entrapment operation into which grifters like the Clintons fell into. And people like Clintons, and probably anyone who heads for the White House, is allowed to get there on the basis that he's controlled or she's controlled through blackmail or extortion. And if you Google Serco and pedophilia, you know that they're operating for the British police a global pedophile face recognition service.
I think that's
So
just going to
again,
bring up. If I
you've
Google
got this,
Serco and pedophilia, I'd probably just get Able Danger pages, right?
right. Well, we've been writing about it long enough, but for me, the clock is ticking, right? It's ticking for our show, of course, is that now that the Americans have allowed Serco to embed itself in key government and military agencies to the point now where they can execute at any time a man-in-the-middle attack on the United States of America that would make 911 look like a cakewalk. And it's folly on a scale. It's treasonous. It's disingenuous. It's stupid. It's extremely dangerous. Because remember, the modern parameters of these operations are you've got to neutralize carbon footprints. And the only way of neutralizing carbon footprints is depopulation, sterilization, civil wars, murders, etc., etc. And anyone who stands in the way or doesn't allow their technology to be used for this thing is in danger of being killed.
Well, and I mean, again, I reiterate that we never accused George H. Swigert of direct involvement in anything having to do with John Benet Ramsey. Just pointed out the fact that their family owned a cordless phone and placed a phone call to the police on it. So that's accurate. And frankly, you and I speculating about these things, even if they're incorrect, if it led to the discovery that this cordless phone call was placed and that the police heard voices after Patsy Ramsey thought the phone was hung up, well, that's a revelation that we've come upon. We may never explore anything having to do with George Henry Swigert again, but it is an interesting path to walk if it leads us to a piece of information that could be helpful or in some way related to that case. David, before we close for today, I've taken us on a virtual journey to the BBC headquarters here in London. I don't know if you're familiar enough with the building that we could, wait, perhaps this is it right here. I think this might be the statue in question. Do we know if the BBC followed people's requests and actually removed this thing, or is it still there?
It hasn't been removed.
That seems crazy to me.
And to me, it celebrates a culture of pedophilia,
Yeah.
homosexual pedophilia within a sovereign government that actually means everyone uh, in that government is vulnerable to entrapment and extortion. So what I'm saying is the foreign policy of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and I think we were looking at the CCEB, the uh, Central Communications Electronics Board, originally formed in 1942 with the United States and the United Kingdom, and then subsequently, I think in 52, um, Australia and Canada joined, and then later New Zealand. These are the Five Eyes countries.
Yeah.
If you look at the Federal Bridge, what I think I've determined now is that it's a pay-to-play racket on the Federal Bridge, and if you pay the parties the right amount of money, which I believe it goes to the global custodians of Serco, you get a fiber optic link into the Federal Bridge, which gives you superb high bandwidth communications to other people on the Federal Bridge. So in the event of a nuclear attack, the elite and the insiders can retreat into the luxury hotel basements, and the peasants get fried out in the streets. And very interestingly, RCAGB 1929, post World War II, got the contract for the 4-minute warning of a nuclear attack on the British Isles. Now, 4 minutes is not very long, so who would you reserve your 4-minute warning for? You can't alert everyone, right? So why not what David Rockefeller describes as the world banker, a supranational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite? Over to you.
And didn't Hillary Clinton have some sort of a gaffe during one of the presidential debates where she revealed the amount of time that the president has to make a decision once a nuclear strike has been launched?
Well, it's not very much, you see, and there's that whole philosophy about mutually assured destruction. But right now, with your 18 intelligence agencies, America does not have a rapid first response to a nuclear attack. It's been dismantled, and I think they tested it out on 911. When you think that the United States Air Force was either stood down or scrambled in the wrong direction, so they couldn't eyeball what was going on over Washington and New York, it's very obvious this was a man on the middle attack that Americans still haven't got their heads around. But I think you and I have, right? And I think we can share that with our audience. And once again, what I would like to see, and I immensely value the contributions people are making financially because that helps us move along. But what I would like to see, if everyone who listens to us and finds the argument that we're making persuasive, they invite a friend to come along and join, and we try and get this movement viral, because no matter how hard I kick at Serco, I think they call it the dead cat bounce, right? Like, why haven't they responded? Why haven't they sued me for libel?
Well,
Do they think I'm being vexatious for, you know what I mean?
I would
They're
presume
terrified.
they're not aware of these broadcasts. I mean, this is something I've heard Field McConnell ask repeatedly. Why has this person not responded? How do we know they even know we're talking about this? Maybe they're not watching YouTube.
If you Google Serco, Field McConnell, David Hawkins, etc., there's millions of hits, right? So it's deeply pervasive. These people have very good intelligence. Remember what Serco said about digital fires at the Marine Corps base in Camp Pendleton, looking for the vulnerabilities of the enemy. The question is, of course, who is the enemy? I think the enemy for the people meeting on the 47th floor on the morning of 9/11, the shareholders of Serco, very probably or possibly hosted by Serco's investment banker, Wilbur Ross, I think they have a different enemy to what the average American has. I think their enemy is we the people.
And David, it was just last week that I did an interview with a guy named Luke Slytalker, who is an online persona who's been investigating some of the releases from the Dark Overlord, which is an unknown hacker entity, either a person or a group of people who, according to the Dark Overlord, has obtained, I guess through hacking, legal documents from law firms and insurance companies, etc., that have been involved in litigation related to 9/11. The latest bit of information that Luke has been sharing with me, we haven't done a show about this yet, but it's the involvement of this company, NEAL, which is a nuclear, I guess it stands for like Nuclear Electronic Insurance Liability or something like that. It's a company that insures nuclear facilities and things that involve nuclear cleanup. And there is the existence of, I need to check my notes with Luke, but I think it's thorium, some sort of nuclear, radioactive particle that's only present when there is a fusion reaction like that of a very small hydrogen bomb, which would have tremendous energetic, explosive power, but as I understand it, reduced radiation.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know about that, but if they're insuring nuclear plants, maybe they're insuring the atomic weapons establishment in the United Kingdom,
Maybe.
which is run by Lockheed Martin, Serco, and Jacobs Engineering, which means that Lockheed Martin, Serco, and Jacobs Engineering are actually manufacturing, distributing, selling, storing, and disposing of nuclear weapons. I'm saying this is crazy, right? And those are long-term agreements that go through to 2025 or whatever it was, which means that you've actually handed off the government defense against nuclear attack to a private company. Now, Serco, for example, was accused of moving prisoners around the United Kingdom,
Right.
And charging the taxpayer when those prisoners were either dead, back in jail, or overseas, or had never been prisoners before. So there was a huge investigation into Serco, and Christopher Hyman, the chief executive officer who was in the windows of the World Restaurant on the morning of 9/11 and very conveniently went down to the 47th floor, I think he either resigned or fired. The new boss of Serco is one Rupert Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill. Rupert Soames's brother, Nicholas Soames, is the man who was the personal assistant to Senator Mark Hatfield in the late 1970s, where Hatfield was the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee at about the time, I believe, when Christine Marcy was Mendenhall and conceived of a baby. And you and I have discussed that, and no one has come up with an explanation of why she should have had a Mendenhall's baby in August of 1979.
We've had our friend in Poland, however, split hairs over the semantics of how you've stated some of these things, which is interesting. Well, David, we're really out of time, but the one last point that I'd like to make is that it's always fascinating how I think you have got a really unique knack for basically juxtaposing seemingly totally unrelated events like this tunnel crash of Dodi Al-Fayed and Princess Diana of Wales, and then linking that to the deaths on 9/11 and some of the technologies used. The last thing I wanted to ask about, because as I said, it does cause me to think about Michael Hastings. Were there any similarities? I mean, you've told me that there were yaw marks, but no skid marks. And as I Google around, I'm having a very, very difficult time finding any decent, detailed photographs of the interior of the tunnel and the street that would indicate the tire marks. Same thing with Michael Hastings. I don't see giant skid marks leading up to this tree here, so it wasn't a matter of him slamming on the brakes to avoid a person in the street or something. He just drove straight into the tree. Then again, I guess the same is true of Diana's crash.
Yeah, and that looks like a dead straight road, so why would you drive down the tree? I don't know what the traffic was or what the witnesses say. But again, I think the beauty of the approach that you and I are collectively taking, I think, is not to make statements about murder and all the rest of it, where the remedy might be going into the criminal courts and trying to get a conviction beyond reasonable doubt, but go to the balance of probability argument that their deaths appear to be connected to the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices, in the custody of X, where then X is liable for a class action suit or a civil action for damages. Right? And I think that's a much gentler approach, less risk of libeling someone. And my work with my colleagues in artificial intelligence suggests that when you start looking for mens rea in organizations which are run through artificial intelligence algorithms, you don't find it, because most of these people are scientifically and technically illiterate. I don't want to be rude, but anyone, for example, that says the trace gas carbon dioxide can drive catastrophic anthropogenic global warming has to be scientifically illiterate, because there are ways of demonstrating that, like correlation or experiment, or going back to the fossil record to see what the carbon dioxide percentage was in plants at times of high global temperature or low global temperature. And what's really scary, of course, is whilst there is almost a perfect correlation every 100,000 years associated with the precession of the equinox, where the sun and the earth are close for about 10,000 years in what is known as an interglacial period, and then the earth goes out on a kind of elliptical orbit, there's almost a perfect correlation over 100,000 years cycle, but it's in the wrong direction. So as the temperature goes up, carbon dioxide comes out of solution at the top 1 foot of the ocean, and the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases about 800 years later after a peak of temperature. So it doesn't precede the temperature, it follows, right?
Yeah.
Conversely, the I'm never quite familiar with the paleontological or whatever it is, the geochronological sequence, there's only 2 periods in geochronological time, one in the Permian and one at the present, where historically the temperature and the carbon dioxide are at lows. So right now, carbon dioxide is lower than it's ever been geochronologically, together with the temperature that's lower, right?
Well,
so there's no, go ahead.
No, there's no what?
There is no, the correlation is in the wrong direction over 100,000 years cycle, right, for the theory of global warming. That is to say, the reality is that carbon dioxide percentages follow temperature peaks, right?
Right.
And geochronologically, we're right now in a low period, and we should be getting ready for the next ice age.
Well,
right?
But David, as you said, we do have people who are scientifically ignorant, and I'm thinking, in fact, of the socialist media sensation and freshman Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is definitely scientifically illiterate and is definitely promoting some falsehoods relative to pollution of the planet and carbon dioxide and global warming and all of these things that she's promoting. But David, I think we're going to have to carry on our conversation on Friday. I'd like to remind all of our viewers that every Friday, David and I are doing a show that is exclusively for Patreon sponsors. People can go to patreon.com/reverse CSI Storyboards and become sponsors of David's Patreon page. It's really important that people do this. David's got all the videos that we do together, as well as blog posts that he's putting there even more frequently. So it's a great spot to go to read all about David's research, and of course, to financially support David. I would also appreciate people going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. The entirety of Crowdsource the Truth is viewer supported, so there are no corporate sponsors, there are no outside grants or anything like that. All of this information is provided simply by the financial sponsorship paid by viewers. So that's how we're keeping this information honest, by not allowing someone to infiltrate with financial influence. David, I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you so much. And anything you'd like to say before we close today?
No, I just think we've become, and I think that's very encouraging, addicted to the truth. Over to you.
That's right. All right, David. Well, listen, I'll be back later today at 5 p.m. with Charles Ortel. And David, I'll speak to you on Friday.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.
Thank you very much.